Probably a kind of illusion that it has mostly to do with some biochemical responses and substances and all this, but in fact, as we see and as many scholars have noted, it's a rather broad, rather general problem, and I'm trying to treat this problem from a more general perspective. And my talk will include several aspects. I'm trying to link together the issues of addiction, spirituality, self-regulation, and I'll trying to present a kind of phenomenological analysis of what is addiction as a human phenomenon, so to say, and try to link it with spirituality and self-regulation issue. So the problem can be articulated in the form presented in a recent annual review on addiction. So I'd say that the key point is that not everyone who tries drugs or anything becomes addicts. The essence of addiction is just when this is the transition from causal drug use to compulsive patterns. So it's the compulsivity of addiction that makes it a real problem, and not only drugs, not only alcohol and substances create this compulsive pattern of drug use and of use in general. So when we speak of addiction, we can have quite different things in mind, and I looked at some literature and found that there can be very, very broad things are covered by this label addiction. First, a very natural and traditional thing, alcohol and drug abuse, as that is often identified with addiction. But besides, we have things like smoking, eating disorders, sex addiction, and some further things, shopaholism, compulsive gambling, and internet addiction, and cell phone dependency, and TV addiction, and money addiction, and power addiction, and violence addiction. And then there is a number of patients that also can become a kind of addiction, workaholism, philately, and data collecting, and so on, and so on, and so on. Well, where is the borderline between the norm and the pathology deviation, and how much workaholism is a clinical phenomenon or not as much, and where is generally, and so recently everyone has the possibility to watch the World Championship, well, not only by TV, but how people behaved, soccer fans. Well, it's also definitely a kind of addiction, and by its behavioral mechanisms, very close to what we treat in forms of in clinical forms as alcohol and drug addiction. So, what's in common in all those patterns of behavior is a kind of absolute monarchy. So the objects being absolutely different, but the pattern is close because the function is close. The object of addiction completely rules one's life, leaving no choice. The addicts have no possibility to choose whether to follow the addiction, the passion, the motive, or not. It's really a compulsive pattern, and etymologically, Latin word addictus meant an ex-free man sentenced to slavery for debts usually and deprived of freedom. So addiction is a slavery in this sense. So one is no more free. One is no more master of one's own behavior, one's own activity, motivation, and this seems to be the common feature of all those, of the whole spectrum of patterns I described, whatever different they could be. the basic phenomenology of addiction is that an addict cannot choose whether to follow the wish or not. And the wish itself, as you see, need not be destructive itself. It must be, well, everything excessive can become an addiction, and what is the most destructive and unhealthy in any kind of addiction is not so much the object of addictions, what we do strive for, but mostly the mechanism, the way we do it. So we don't pay attention to anything else. We have no choice. We are in slavery. We are mastered, we're governed by just one motive. And what we are unable in this case, we are unable, as in most of the cases, we lack the capacity characteristic of most mature humans to delay gratification, to mediate gratification, to seize gratification, even to sacrifice gratification of some immediate need for the sake of something else, of something important. No, in the case of addictions, one cannot do anything like this with all this addiction, including workaholism. I cannot sacrifice my drive, so my addiction to work for something more reasonable, even if I may be well aware that it makes more sense in this situation here and now. And one is totally absorbed in one's patient and can take a stand toward this patient. So it's essentially addiction is a phenomenon from the field of self-regulation. And one of the general typologies of dependencies I met is the typology that belongs to Elizabeth Lucas, the current leader of logotherapy school after Viktor Frankl's death, Frankl's first disciple. And she has a special book on logotherapeutic work with dependencies, and that's her classification. Dependency on resonance from the others' rewards and punishments, dependency on resonance from significant others, not from everyone, but from special persons, dependency on interiorized rules, traditions, bans, and taboos, and so on, dependency on one's own emotions, and independency of external effects, but dependency on personal assumptions, so on one's self-image, one's self-conception, and this is a very broad view of dependencies, still more broad probably than the one I presented. Is just to illustrate that addiction can be, and dependency is it's not a special clinical phenomenon, but a rather broad one. Then stop a while with addiction, and now what is spirituality? Spirituality is usually defined as something close but not equal to religiosity, religious faith, the search of the sacred but not in established confessional forms. I did a lot of, I saw a lot of literature on these topics, and there is a lot of confusion and indeterminacy till now. Sometimes it's defined in terms of creativity, sometimes in terms of unselfishness, caring, altruistic, moral, etc. Today we heard the identification of spirituality with some positive emotions. I cannot dwell on it, but I disagree with this viewpoint either. But that is generally spirituality is identified with some definite beliefs, but if I believe in the supernatural, in God, if I have faith and love and all those emotions, if I believe in some ultimate truth or meaning, and I'm ready to give everything I have, including my life itself, for the prevalence of this truth, of this meaning, that means that I'm either a truly devoted spiritual person or a truly devoted fanatic terrorist who is also, it's the person who is ready to give everything and for the affirmation of some ultimate truth, and a religion and hundreds and thousands of lives is not a high price for the affirmation of this higher meaning. How to differentiate those two evidently different cases? There are some old and not so old truth sayings that helps to differentiate. So put your trust on those seeking the truth and beware those who claim to have found it. An old saying. Two genuine spiritual leaders can always come to terms despite differences in their teaching, unlike two devoted fanatics. And the third is Olper's saying that mature faith is fashioned in the workshop of doubt. What I mean to say here, so the spirituality and addicted fanaticism, it's a kind of dichotomy. Fanaticism is a form of quasi-spiritual addiction to some final meaning or truth. Aggressive righteousness and spirituality is, on the contrary, an incessant quest for meaning, with a humble awareness of relativity of any findings and solutions, tolerance for ambiguity and indeterminacy, lack of hierarchy. So in terms of Socrates saying, I know only that I know nothing. So the doubts is essentially the humility, the essence of any spiritual attitude. It's just one side of spirituality. So it's among the psychological theories, probably the most relevant one is Maslow's third motivational theory, because Maslow had several different theories of human motivation. Well, the third motivational theory, the theory of metamotivation and being values. So he tried to describe motivation of those individuals who has grown beyond self-actualization to what he called the level of being rather than becoming. And at this level, there is nothing like a hierarchy of basic needs, but rather a system of ultimate being values like truth, beauty, justice, meaningfulness, dichotomy-transcendence. All this is that guides one's behavior. And these values make the structure of motivation of these individuals, but they make no hierarchical structure. On the contrary, every value is defined through the others, and if one contrasts one value to the others, this is just, in Maslow's words, a rigid fanaticism having nothing in common with self-actualization and true being. The second side of spirituality, well, Frankl describes spirituality as one of human existential, so to say. The second side of spirituality is that it's not something given, it's a way of dealing with what is given to us. It presupposes some activity, effort, spiritual discipline, exercise. It's always a spirituality. It's something incompatible with letting go. It's conscious effort, usually on the basis of it, is in its developmental. In its development, always a conscious effort must be present, a conscious discipline. And if you have a look at the writings of religious leaders and the history of the saints, so it's always the very important point is a kind of work upon oneself. It's a stand to oneself, a stand to any aspect of oneself, the possibility to disengage and disidentify with one's wish, traits, genes, behavior, body, etc. And humor is one of the very precise and bright expressions of this capacity. But anyway, there is the essence of this stand is that there is me and there is my wish, and or my emotion, or my habit, or something like this. It's not yet me. There is what Frankl described, well, what he called with German word Person. It's not the same as person in English. It's a kind of spiritual center that can take stand to any, to any behavioral pattern, something that that is not equal to character, to traits, to anything, but it's a position from which I can relate to any part and any aspects of myself. And being whole and authentic spiritual person is never equal to oneself, can always transcend his or her past, because I see here is my wish and I am not equal to my wish. This is my wish, I can change it. Now the third concept, self-regulation. I prefer to use the word auto-regulation coined by Jan Balsiner from Clark University. That means essentially the same as self-regulation without the presumption of self. I don't know what is self. Well, auto-regulation is essentially the same without necessarily speaking of self. I don't want to speak of self. And so definition, working definition, inbuilt mechanism of maintaining the process we call behavior, activity, life, up to some criteria. Through feedback loops, I will not dwell upon it, but what kind of criteria our behavior, our life must conform. In some theories, different criteria has been proposed. Goals in a very well-known self-regulation theory by Carrer and Shire, and in the arguing with them, Csikszentmihalyi and Nakamura proposed experiences as ultimate criterion, but it doesn't matter. Most general formulation, the life process that connects me to the world, my activity, my behavior, my conduct should correspond both to the way I am and to the way the world is. So, two sides of any regulation. And I described a cycle of auto-regulation, all kind of human activity in life includes two phases. One phase, open phase, loose phase, openness to the multiplicity of possibilities, unselective scanning and weighting options. Change for the second phase, concentration on the selected way, directed implementation of the chosen goal. So tough phase or closed phase, and in some psychological approaches in special fields it has been described as two phases of action and two mechanisms of attention or regulation. But in fact, there are two mechanisms of distortions of this regulation when we cannot easily switch from one phase to another, and instead of this we stick just to one phase, and I call it Hamlet case and Macbeth case. Hamlet case, it's incapacity to choose direction and to move to the second phase. And Macbeth case is incapacity to disengage from the chosen direction, to put it into equation, or to change it, to come back to the first stage. And it's very close to the case of addiction. And spirituality refers to the structure of regulation criteria. If we, in case of, when we speak of spirituality, we have no single unified criterion, but a hierarchy of being values as the ultimate criterion. And, back to addiction. Now, to combine it, so I have no time to speak of this aspect that we cannot define it in terms of emotions, because when we are striving toward emotional rewards or positive effects, we can change the emotions from any source, and the emotions received, positive emotions received from different sources are the same. So when we find a single source, we can stick to it and don't look for anything else. Unlike this, when we, and that's why hedonism favors addictions, and it's different with meaning, because we can never get satisfied when we're striving for meaning rather than for positive emotions, because different sources of meaning, they are not interchangeable. They cannot substitute one for another, like in case of emotions. Theoretical summary, I had to skip some points. Theoretical summary that addiction refers to unquestionable following one dominant motive and dependency on emotional rewards at any price without the option of choosing. And this is the form of autoregulation distortion, reduced open phase and hypertrophied closed phase of autoregulation cycle. Spirituality, based on the hierarchy of being values, buffers addiction. And quest for meaning insatiable by a soul source buffers addiction. Sticking to final, further unquestioned beliefs and meanings has more to do with addiction than with spirituality. Affirming some final ultimate truth has more to do with addiction than with spirituality. Well, excuse me.
We can take a few questions.
First of all, if you're open to it, do you